Let's start at the beginning. The Australian Workplace Equality Index, or AWEI, was launched in 2010 by ACON's Pride and Diversity program. It's a voluntary benchmarking tool that rates organizations on LGBTQ+ inclusion. Companies submit evidence of their policies, like gender-neutral facilities and inclusive language audits, and are awarded bronze, silver, gold, or platinum tiers. While participation is technically free, achieving higher tiers often means paying for consulting or membership, turning AWEI into a de facto compliance ecosystem. But how did this tool become so influential, and why does it matter for businesses across Australia? AWEI's real power comes from its integration into ESG, environmental, social, and governance frameworks. Major Australian banks like Commonwealth Bank and NAB reference diversity indices such as AWEI in their sustainability-linked loans and investment criteria. This means that a company's AWEI score can influence its access to capital and investment, embedding AWEI deep within the financial system. The Reserve Bank of Australia and APRA guidelines further reinforce this, making AWEI a key player in the ESG landscape. Money is at the heart of AWEI's influence. While joining is free, moving up the tiers often involves significant costs: consulting fees, membership dues, and compliance expenses. For example, consulting can run $347 per hour, and annual memberships are over $6,000. This creates a financial ecosystem where organizations pay to maintain or improve their AWEI status, and these costs cascade through the supply chain. The result: a system where money drives ideological capture and compliance becomes a business necessity. AWEI's influence creates a pyramid of compliance. At the top sits ACON and AWEI, followed by major banks, then large corporations, SME suppliers, and finally, schools and institutions at the base. Large corporates often require their suppliers to match their AWEI commitments, pushing compliance down the chain. This isn't mandated by law, but the pressure is real, especially when ESG reporting leaves room for private tools like AWEI to fill the gaps. Despite being voluntary, AWEI's system is deeply entrenched. ESG reporting in Australia emphasizes material risks but leaves metrics flexible, allowing private tools like AWEI to fill the void. There's no legal requirement to participate, but the pressure from banks and corporates makes disengagement challenging. This voluntary nature is both a strength and a vulnerability. Organizations can, in theory, opt out, but the practical barriers are significant. Why would organizations want to disengage from AWEI? For some, it's about cost. Compliance can be expensive, especially for smaller businesses. For others, it's about autonomy and transparency. Critics argue that AWEI's standards may not align with every organization's values or operational realities. There's also concern about ideological capture, where private benchmarks dictate public and private policy. Understanding these motivations is key to exploring pathways for change. Disengaging from AWEI isn't as simple as flipping a switch. The system is sticky. Once embedded in ESG frameworks and supply chains, it's hard to unwind. There's no formal process for opting out, and organizations risk losing access to capital or contracts if they drop their AWEI status. However, targeted pressure, alternative metrics, and regulatory leverage can make disengagement possible. Let's look at some realistic strategies. The first pathway is direct engagement with banks. Banks aren't locked into using AWEI. They can choose other metrics for the social pillar of ESG. Shareholder and client pressure can push banks to diversify their metrics. For example, shareholder resolutions can demand transparency about how much weight AWEI carries in loan decisions. Client coalitions, such as chambers of commerce, can petition for AWEI-neutral lending, highlighting the costs of compliance. Shareholder resolutions are a powerful tool. Major banks in Australia are partly owned by global funds like BlackRock and Vanguard, which prioritize ESG but also demand transparency. By filing resolutions, stakeholders can require banks to disclose how AWEI scores impact lending decisions. This approach has precedent. Similar actions in the US forced banks to reveal the financial impact of their diversity metrics. Another approach is forming client coalitions. By rallying affected businesses, especially SMEs, organizations can collectively petition banks for more neutral lending criteria. Highlighting the real costs of AWEI compliance, such as time and donations, can make a compelling case. This collective action can encourage banks to adopt neutral tools like Sustainalytics or custom audits, reducing reliance on AWEI. If banks respond to these pressures, they may pivot to more neutral ESG tools, reducing AWEI's influence. For example, NAB's 2024 ESG report already emphasizes double materiality, considering both firm and societal impact. Regulatory scrutiny, such as ASIC's crackdown on greenwashing, adds further leverage. While banks may resist using proprietary models, the landscape is shifting, and pilot changes could happen within 6-12 months. The next strategy is to target large corporates and break the supply chain cascade. Platinum-level AWEI status requires suppliers to reflect similar values, but this is advisory, not contractual. Corporates often adopt AWEI for procurement advantages, especially in government tenders. By challenging these practices, organizations can reduce the pressure on SMEs and encourage broader, more flexible ESG certifications. Forming coalitions to review procurement contracts is a practical step. By demanding that AWEI be listed as optional, not mandatory, organizations can create space for alternative certifications. There's precedent for this. In the UK, supplier boycotts of Stonewall's equivalent program led to a significant drop in participation. Similar actions in Australia could reduce the pressure on SMEs to sign up for lower-tier AWEI status. Promoting alternative certifications is another effective strategy. Government-backed badges like the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, WGEA, or international standards like ISO 30415 offer broader, customizable diversity management options. These alternatives satisfy regulatory requirements without the specific demands of AWEI, giving organizations more flexibility and reducing compliance costs. Amplifying the message through public campaigns can accelerate change. Social media threads, public petitions, and tagging influential corporates can raise awareness of the toll booth model and highlight conflicts of interest. For example, exposing taxpayer funding for ACONs programs can influence procurement decisions and encourage organizations to reconsider their AWEI commitments. If these strategies succeed, the pressure on suppliers to adopt AWEI will decrease. SMEs can avoid unnecessary compliance costs, and corporates can diversify their ESG credentials. There's precedent for this. Media exposés and public scrutiny have already led some organizations to review their ties to AWEI. As investor sentiment shifts, especially with rising anti-woke movements, corporates may find it easier to adopt alternative approaches. The third pathway is regulatory and policy advocacy. AWEI's power comes from gaps in mandatory ESG standards, especially for the social pillar. By lobbying regulators and policymakers, organizations can push for rules that require transparency and sideline private indices like AWEI. This includes submitting to regulatory task forces, engaging with MPs, and framing the issue as anti-competitive. Submitting to regulatory task forces like ASIC's ESG task force can create pressure for change. By arguing that AWEI enables ideological capture, advocates can request mandatory disclosure of third-party metrics in lending decisions. Parliamentary engagement, such as proposing amendments to the Banking Code of Practice, can further limit the use of non-transparent ESG proxies. There's also potential to involve competition regulators if AWEI is seen as monopolistic. If successful, regulatory advocacy could mandate the use of global, neutral standards like GRI, reducing AWEI's dominance. Public scrutiny and media coverage can accelerate this process. While regulatory change is slow, often taking years, recent ESG disclosure laws and ongoing reviews create opportunities for advocates to make their case. There are several roadblocks to disengagement. Over 200 organizations participate in AWEI, and banks cite its benchmarking value. Entrenched adoption, backlash risk, global ESG pressure, and resource intensity for SMEs all pose challenges. However, these can be mitigated by framing the issue as pro-transparency and pro-competition, highlighting cost-benefit analyses, and partnering with advocacy groups. Full disengagement from AWEI is unlikely in the short term. Its 15-year entrenchment mirrors similar programs overseas which took years to unwind. However, partial decoupling is achievable. With persistent advocacy, 20–30% of firms could shift metrics by 2027, starting with bank engagement and scaling to policy. The goal isn't to reject inclusion, but to reclaim it from private gatekeepers and ensure transparency and fairness in ESG compliance.